On April 28, 1988, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 took off from Hawaii's Hilo International Airport. The flight took less than an hour to reach Honolulu, despite the perfect weather and conditions. A few minutes after takeoff, the jet was shaken completely by a loud boom. The first-class cabin's roof was abruptly torn off with an explosive device. Panic struck the passengers and aircraft crew. Would the vast blue sky suck them out? Could they do a safe landing in an emergency? Would the remainder of the aircraft disintegrate at any moment? Stay tuned as we go into this frightening incident and many more like it to discover exactly what happened. On that fatal day, First Officer Madeline Tompkins and Captain Robert Schornsheimer were among the 6 crew members and 89 passengers on Flight 243. They collectively possessed almost 10,000 hours of flight time with the Boeing 737. The aircraft, which was 19 years old and roughly 10 years away from its anticipated end of life, had completed 3 round-trip flights from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai earlier that day. The aircraft had just passed an airworthiness directive by 2 different inspectors and a Boeing service bulletin. Therefore, nothing out of the ordinary was found during the pre-departure check. The airplane was in perfect shape and ready to fly on paper, but as one passenger was entering, she spotted a crack in the fuselage of the aircraft about midway between the aircraft door and the bridge canopy. She peered out over the boarding bridge. She didn't mention it to any ground crew or workers. Assuming the staff must have known about it, pre-flight inspections were successful after all. The aircraft got off without any problems. The plane started to ascend, going higher and higher, while continuing to remind passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The pilots heard it as they were leveling off the aircraft at about 24,000 feet. A blast, a massive, cacophonous eruption, was followed by the sound of wind rushing. With her head thrown back, First Officer Tompkins spotted bits of debris floating around in the cockpit that looked like insulation foam. The pilots discovered the entry door to the cockpit was missing at that moment, and all they could see was blue sky where the first-class ceiling should have been. Passengers in first class were gripping their seats tightly, completely afraid. They had seen a tiny portion of the left side of the aircraft burst, causing the cabin to explode, and winds of up to 300 miles per hour to rip off the roof. The cabin air systems of aircraft regulate temperature, pressurization, and airflow. In order to prevent passengers from freezing or suffocating during their journey, these systems are essential, since the higher in the atmosphere a plane travels, the less oxygen there is, and the colder it becomes. However, these systems fail when explosive decompression occurs, which is why oxygen masks fall from the ceiling on passenger aircraft. On Flight 243, however, the oxygen masks of the passengers had been ripped off along with an 18-foot part of the plane's sidewalls and roof over their heads. The cabin crew who had been standing there had to clutch to everything to keep from being swept off their feet. But sadly, one of them didn't make it in time. Thankfully, they were still strapped into their seats. Clarabelle Lansing, the first attendant, was swiftly swept out of the hole that opened in the aircraft's left side. Despite being flung to the ground, Michelle Honda, the number 2 attendant, was able to crawl up and down the aisle to check on the passengers and attempt to maintain their composure. Assuming full responsibility for the cockpit, the pilots put on their own oxygen masks. It didn't take them long to realize that all of their controls felt loose. The aircraft was pitching back and forth as if it would suddenly plummet from the sky. In order to alert Honolulu of the necessity of an emergency landing in neighboring Maui, Tompkins programmed their transponder to an emergency code. However, the noise level in the cockpit was so high that none of her communications could be heard. The pilots were unable to hear or speak to each other with the flight attendants, and thus, they started an emergency descent using hand signals. Without wasting any time, they descended quickly, at one point falling more than 4,100 feet per minute. In order to avoid a precipitous or unmanageable descent, the optimal rate of descent for passenger aircraft operating above 10,000 feet is around 3,000 feet per minute. However, given the already unmanageable state of Flight 243, their only objective was to land as soon as possible. They eventually descended below 14,000 feet. After successfully accessing Maui's emergency channel, Tompkins asked for an emergency landing and medical supplies for what she believed would be a large number of injured and dead. At Kahului Airport, Maui started making arrangements as the first-class passengers started to choke from a shortage of oxygen. Captain Schornsteiner decelerated the aircraft in compliance with air traffic control speed regulations as soon as they descended below 10,000 feet. They started to gently steer the aircraft in the direction of the runway at this altitude, where they could at least breathe. He realized that the plane was becoming less responsive when he reduced the speed to 170 knots, or roughly 195 miles per hour. He had no choice except to travel at least 130 knots, or around 50 miles per hour slower, in order to land. Either get to the runway and run the chance of crashing in, or slow down and lose control of the aircraft in the air dot in an incredibly quick landing. It was a breakneck 170 knots. Tompkins was given the command to lower the landing gear. One extension light was not green, but the main gear light showed green. There was no nose gear engaged. Even after they manually overrode the computer to drop it, the light would not go out. They gave it another go and depressed the override handle, but the light remained off. Normally, they could check through a viewer to see whether it was down, but it was blocked, so the captain insisted on landing the plane right away, rather than waste time trying to clear it. Should he be mistaken, and the front landing gear not be fully engaged, they would strike the asphalt at nearly 200 miles per hour without any means of stabilizing the aircraft's front end. They had no choice except to pray, even though it would undoubtedly crash. Fortunately, it turned out that the landing gear indication lights were broken. The nose gear was in fact down, and Schornsteiner and Tompkins made a successful landing on the runway 13 minutes after the massive decompression. Everyone was in disbelief at what Kahului Airport's emergency services found there. Like a sardine can, the plane had been torn apart. Out of the 89 passengers and crew members, 8 suffered serious injuries. 1 person died, Carabel Lansing. The aircraft was also irreparably damaged. As far as I'm aware, passenger jets such as this one aren't designed to be convertibles. What in the world occurred then? The skin of an airplane's fuselage is normally about 2.5 millimeters thick, or roughly the same thickness as 2 credit cards. It is composed of sheet metal, which was installed on Boeing 737S in panels that were roughly 2 meters wide and 4 meters long. They are fastened together by drilling holes into their edges and fastening them together with a number of rivets. The investigators began to think that the original hole had occurred at these overlapped joints, since evidently the skin is weaker there. After that, they spoke with the passenger, who stated she had observed a fissure in the fuselage before to take off. She indicated the precise spot where investigators thought the first hole had been before strong winds tore off the remaining roof. How, then, had two different inspectors overlooked this crack? It found out that the Federal Aviation Administration only required fuselage inspections along the two most important joints in order to keep the expense of assessing older Boeing aircraft low. Each airline had the discretion to inspect the other joints, even after operating the aircraft in an extremely corrosive and salty overseas environment for 35,496 hours, or 4 years. Aloha Airlines had not felt the need to check every single joint. This mixture of complacency on the part of the maintenance staff ultimately caused Flight 243's terrible ordeal. Because of the severe breakdown of maintenance standards, U.S. officials redesigned the inspection procedure for all older aircraft in their possession. A mandatory corrosion control program was designed. The Airworthiness Assurance Task Force was formed, and if a flaw was discovered on one aircraft, a fleet-wide reinspection might be ordered. It was a massive, costly project, but Clarabelle Lansing couldn't pursue it at this point. Her body was never located, which is unfortunate, but things could have turned out worse if the crew hadn't shown such incredible bravery. They were duly acclaimed as heroes, but because to negligent maintenance procedures, they wouldn't be the last crew to survive anything as terrifying. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.